So we're going to have a quick look at what is discrimination, and my role at Commission is to deal with complaints about discrimination. I do that pretty much as the majority of my work. I also do training as well. Okay. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We'll talk about responsibilities at work as well, both for employers and employees. We're going to have a look at a couple of case studies and some of the diversity projects that we're involved in at Commission. And a lot of those are done in conjunction with other agencies in the public sector as well. So we'll just go through. All right. Unlawful discrimination. What are we talking about there? Has anybody got any idea when we talk about unlawful discrimination? What sort of things might come to mind?
Not having a good legal reason for dismissing someone.
For
dismissing someone?
Yeah, okay. So that could be. It depends on whether or not it's covered by what we call a characteristic of discrimination. And in your kits you'll have a when is it discrimination checklist. So I'm not going to go too much into some of the grounds of discrimination, but it has to be covered by the Act. It needs to be an unlawful ground of discrimination. So if someone is dismissed because of their caring responsibilities, their race, their age, their gender or their sexuality, then that could be a form of unlawful discrimination. And unlawful discrimination can be in terms of both direct and indirect discrimination. Okay, so the direct stuff's pretty obvious. It's the stuff where someone might make a comment about the fact that you work part-time and you have caring responsibilities, and you know that makes it too difficult to get the work done, that you know it's really a bit of a nuisance for us, we really need people to be full-time, those sorts of comments that come out about caring responsibilities and those sorts of things. The other thing where it might be quite overt is when someone makes a comment about someone's sexuality or their race or their age or something like that. Okay, so that's the stuff that's pretty obvious. What we often find is that when we hear about complaints, is we're not hearing so much about the more direct forms of discrimination. It's more the indirect discrimination, and what that often looks like is everyone's being treated the same, but it's unfair to certain people. So again, you know, a person with a disability may find it difficult to access public transport at certain times of the day, and there's a requirement that they be there at 8:30 in the morning for a meeting. And you know, in some places there still isn't a guarantee that you'll get a bus that is accessible if you have a disability, a physical disability in particular, you know, on every bus that comes through on your route or timetable. And in fact, people still in some areas need to ring the night before and ask if there's going to be an accessible bus available on that route. Generally they try to keep them in peak times, but there are still examples where that happens. Okay, so it might seem everyone has to be there at 8:30, that's fine, but on the for a person with a disability who needs to use public transport, that may be something that they can't do. Okay. Other examples again is around that caring responsibilities. You know, we get complaints from people who say, I'm required to work these hours and I can't, you know, I have children to pick up from school or whatever else. Everybody thinks it's fair that everyone has to work 8:30 to 5, but I can't meet that requirement. So it becomes tricky for them as well. Okay. It also has to be unreasonable. So, you know, you just can't say to your employer, I'm not turning up to work at 8:30 because, you know, I have caring responsibilities. You still have to negotiate with them around that as well, okay? Because they still have to get the work done. All right. That's a bit about discrimination and what might be unlawful. So if you look at the sort of things that we're hearing about, you can see there that from there that the main ground of discrimination that we hear about is disability. Often those complaints are related to workers' comp injuries, so that's a biggie as well. Okay, so people not being treated fairly on their return to work, not being offered suitable duties, those sorts of things when they should be able to return to work. The other one is non-work-related injuries as well. It's a common scenario. Psychological injuries, people being treated unfairly on that basis as well, or being put pressure on them at work when they're not supposed to have the same level of pressure or on them as they would normally. Okay. The other one's race, so that's our next highest number of complaints that we hear about. And then you have sex discrimination, age and sexual harassment are fairly closely, as the numbers are about the same there as well. And the area of employment, what a surprise, the area of discrimination is employment. Okay, so most of our complaints are in employment, and again, a lot of them disability in employment as well. In that regard. Goods and services still form a reasonably high percentage of some of the discrimination matters that we hear about. So we're talking about the delivery of services to people, and also people turning up in shops, those sorts of things, and being treated unfairly on the basis of their race or disability or whatever it happens to be in that regard. Okay. Some of this will be fairly obvious to some of you, but most of the discrimination that you and we hear about are based on stereotypes, often associated as fear or anxiety about someone different, or from you, or just concerns about, will I do the right thing? And sometimes even asking questions of people can be offensive as well. So you might want to know more about that person, but the way you might ask the questions may well make them feel like they're being harassed or discriminated against as well. Okay. Ignorance or arrogance. Obviously people have their own prejudices. Sometimes it's driven by hatred, and sometimes it's also driven by envy or resentment towards somebody about what they might or might not be getting that you might not be getting. So we often hear this in terms of programs that promote equity, in terms of gender equity in the workplace, where it may be that some men feel like, well, I'm not getting the same opportunities as some of the women that I work with, and they might find that a bit of a challenge. But the reality is that there's still evidence to show consistently that women still face a whole range of barriers in the workplace, and that they do need additional assistance in order to particularly move into more senior management roles and those sorts of things as well. The other one that comes up sometimes is the issue of race, where Aboriginal people are given, I suppose, extra assistance in order to gain employment, to access education, those sorts of things. And those are really important things, but sometimes other people might feel, well, that's not fair because I didn't get the job, or I didn't get that opportunity. But there's good reasons and good research behind why Aboriginal people need that extra assistance in order to do so, and the benefits that come from that as well for us as a workplace and a society as well. And I suppose that kind of leads into the reasons why we want to embrace and should embrace diversity in the workplace, because it has a huge amount of benefits for the workplace and generally for the community and society as well. I mean, the arguments for diversity, you don't have to look into what organisations like Telstra are doing, Bunnings, Woolworths, Westpac, and they wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't advantages to it. And maybe it comes down to a bottom line, but at the end of the day, those sorts of organisations aren't going to embrace diversity in the workplace if they're not gaining something out of it as well. In terms of responsibilities around discrimination, harassment and victimisation, most employers will have policies and procedures in place, particularly larger employers, and they do that because they've got to be seen to be taking reasonable steps to prevent and to deal with the discrimination. So it's really important and to respond, for organisations to respond quickly, to take things seriously and to deal with things, complaints effectively. And the support that they give to people who are harassed or discriminated against needs to be there as well, right from the beginning. And one of the things that we always talk about is early intervention and prevention of these sorts of things, because we know, again, from the research and best practice, that it is critical in order to basically address the problem, work with the people involved, and to get them back to work as well. And that's what it's really about, and they need to be able to work together effectively, because again, that's about productivity and everything else as well. God, I'm going to get this right in there. Okay. Just threw that one up there, so the keep calm's mottos often comes up. But again, when we're talking about employee responsibilities, this becomes important as well, is that as employees, you need to be familiar with your organisation's policies and procedures. You also need to be prepared to say that's not okay. Put yourself in, well, how would I feel if that was happening to me? And to be able to say, well, it's not okay. And also, you do see somebody who may be being treated unfairly for whatever reason, is that you might check in with them to see if they're okay. You might be able to sort of, I suppose, steer them in a direction where they might be able to access information about policies and procedures about what they can do. But the best way to prevent discrimination, harassment, is to role model the appropriate behaviours and to not discriminate yourself as well, and to help support people who have made mistakes. Okay, there's 7 steps for employers. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but some of it's what I would call bleeding obvious. It should be. The first one, again, treat workers and customers fairly in your dealings with them. So that seems pretty obvious. It's at the end of the day, it's good for your bottom line. Have a policy which rules out discrimination and sexual harassment. Have a procedure in place to deal with complaints. These are just fundamental basics that every employer should be doing. And tell your customers and workers about it regularly. There's no point in just saying at induction to a new employee, we've got policies and procedures, here they are, read them and sign off on this sheet, and that'll be it. You need to continuously reinforce those policies and procedures and be prepared to provide staff with training and information about what they can do on a regular basis. Again, pretty obvious. You get in there early, you handle a complaint quickly, fairly, and you do it with much confidentiality as possible. So on a need-to-know basis. So there'll be people that need to know what's going on, and there'll be other people who don't need to know. So it's about containing that and making sure that it's dealt with a minimum number of people involved. And again, that maintaining, monitoring your culture of equal opportunity as well. There's a whole range of information available on the website about pretty much all we're covering today. But also, if you're interested from an employer perspective, if you're a HR person or something like that, then it's probably worthwhile having a look at those 7 steps in a bit more detail on the website. Okay, again, these are pretty much the benefits of dealing with complaints, and we've talked about some of those already. At the end of the day, I always say to people that if you're worried about the last one, then you're probably going to, that's the least of your worries, okay? Because there's so many things that are already happening. If you're not embracing diversity, if you're not dealing with and preventing discrimination and harassment, you're going to have a whole heap of problems before you think about whether or not there's any sort of legal liability. So that should be the least of your concerns as an employer or a HR person. And inclusive workplaces, so we'll just move on to looking at what makes an inclusive workplace. So flexibility is a biggie, okay? Having flexible work arrangements, allowing people to be able to meet their caring responsibilities, to be able to work flexibly because they have a disability, or whatever it happens to be that allows them, your employees, to be able to work flexibly, generally will bring a whole heap of benefits. And again, I talked about the Telstras and the Bunnings and the Woolworths, and they found that having flexible work arrangements in place has been a huge benefit for them in terms of both recruitment and retention of staff and their bottom line as well. Okay. Again, that role modelling inclusive behaviour, so if we're all being, role modelling inclusive behaviour, then it's going to hopefully be something that gets embedded in the workplace. Other people will see that and they'll start thinking, well, that person's doing the right thing, whatever you want to call it, but it's basically becomes something that's embraced across the workplace. The socially and physically accessible workplaces, again, social stuff can be a really interesting one, because often we hear about people saying like, I feel isolated in the workplace, I can't put my finger on it, but people are going out for coffee and for lunch and I'm not getting invited to that sort of stuff, and I feel isolated, and I think it's because I'm from a different cultural or race background, and people are making assumptions about whether or not I want to go to the pub on a Friday night because I'm Muslim and I don't drink, or whatever it happens to be. And so, that can in and of itself be an indirect form of discrimination as well. Okay, so, it's harder to put your finger on, and people will say, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, but it's a reality that they do feel that they've been treated unfairly and they're not being included in the workplace as well. Awareness training, and again, there's a lot of information out there about unconscious bias, about not actually having it front of mind that you are discriminating, but you have an unconscious bias around whether you want to employ women in management, because there's some, unconsciously you're thinking about how that person's going to fit in, whether they're going to be able to get the work done in the same amount of time, particularly if they do require flexibility and those sorts of things. That person doesn't look like me, they don't feel like me, they talk like me, and therefore I have that unconscious bias can come into play when making decisions as well. Okay. Promoting fairness, again, the emphasis on workers also about what you can do, and I've talked about that before as well. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time, and I know it's going through this quickly, but is to talk about some of the case studies or some things that come up at the Commission as well. So these are examples of a complaint, and I've got another one after this again. So just want to have a quick read through that, but basically Carly, she's a nurse, okay? She is employed on a permanent part-time basis. She is suffering fainting spells. Her doctor, although he's cleared her for work, she can only work on afternoon and day shift. And she basically is being told by her employer that, sorry, until you're cleared to come back to work for all your duties and to work nights as well, we're not going to take you back. Okay. So a couple of questions I'm supposed to think about is, what do you think of this? Is it fair or unfair? Could it be a form of discrimination? Back so you can have another look at it.
She should be able to have a gradual return to work, doing a few hours.
Yeah, it should be, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Does it make any difference if it's a non-work related injury or illness? Are people shaking their heads? That's good. Because even if it is a non-work related injury, the person still can ask to be reasonably accommodated as a result of that injury or illness or whatever it happens to be. So there is an entitlement there. We often hear people say, well, my employer won't let me come back to work until I'm fully fit, even though, and they're saying to me, well, they don't have the same responsibilities as they do if I have a workers' compensation injury. Well, the reality is, even though it's under different piece of legislation, they do need to take steps to look at whether they can accommodate that person back at work as well. So we had a conciliation conference on this matter, and that was the outcome. Unfortunately, she didn't return to work in that workplace. I think that the relationship had been broken down, but she, through the conciliation process that we have at the Commission, she was able to have payment for some economic loss and compensation for injury feelings and an apology from her employer. And her employer didn't admit liability. That was not part of the process. They didn't say, yes, we discriminated against you. This is what they agreed to do to settle the matter. So they could move on, and so Carly could move on. And she found a new job in between time, which was great. And so she was able to go on and work there and no longer had any contact with her employer.
Excuse me, can you enforce the accommodation? An employer's accommodation, right?
Yeah.
How much do they have to accommodate?
Sometimes you don't. No. Yeah, you're right. It's about reasonableness again. And then we always get back to that one. Is it reasonable in the circumstances for an employer to accommodate someone? But basically employers have a responsibility to look at that as an option. It's like anything, whether it's caring responsibilities, disability, those sorts of things. There isn't, they need to look at that in the first instance rather than saying it's all too hard, we're not going to do it, and you need to come back to work full-time, full duties before we'll even consider it. So yeah, always gets down to reasonableness in those matters, and that's where it gets tricky, because what the employer might think is reasonable and what the employee might think is reasonable might not match. But there are examples where it would not be possible for a person to be accommodated as well. This is a large hospital. Maybe if it was a smaller hospital and there was limited staff and resourcing, then maybe they could have said, well, it's not reasonable, we can't do this. But it's an individual circumstances, and all of our complaints need to be looked at from that perspective. Looked at what's the employer able to do, what have they tried, and what is the employee willing to also. I suppose in some cases they need to compromise as well in order to kind of get the outcome that it might not ideally like, but at least they're back at work, they're working, these sorts of things.
Excuse me, are these kinds of things kept confidential? So she goes to move on to another hospital, her previous employer is obviously on her resume or whatever, and they contact that hospital. Is this kind of thing kept confidential? Or are they
The outcome?
Yeah, the outcome.
Yeah. So I mean, most of our agreements are signed with a confidentiality clause.
Okay.
It's a private agreement between the employer and the employee,
Right.
or former employee, and yeah. I mean,
Because hospitals talk to each other and...
yeah, well, yeah, there's not a lot of control over
Yeah.
that, I suppose, but, you know, in terms of, you know, breaching the agreement,
Yeah.
there potentially could be that as an option, but, yeah, again, with referee checks and that sort of thing, you know, it's hard to know exactly what some employers might say and some employers might not say. But they certainly would probably be on, I don't know, maybe on a bit dangerous ground if they went there anyway. So why did you pay her this money? Why did you
Yeah.
apologise to her
Yeah.
if there was if you didn't discriminate, you know? Yeah.
There's victimisation with both, but
Sorry?
she did go to the hospital.
Yeah, and they did
so
that.
hospital.
That could be victimising, yeah. And again, sometimes it's hard to link the two.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions about that particular case study?
Robin, just with that example, after that conciliation thing was over, does the commission also then have a further role with that employer to make sure that, you know, 6 months down the track, you're not there with another employee suffering the same thing?
Yeah, that's interesting because they're already bound by the terms of the agreement, really. But often in the course of conciliation, I have a responsibility because I'm an advocate for the law, not an advocate for either party, but also too, we don't want to see them back there as well. So, you know, I will spend time talking to employers about their responsibilities and those sorts of things and how they might prevent this sort of thing happening again. Hopefully they take some lessons away from that as well. But yeah, good question. No, but some employers will come back and say, well, I'd like to do some training. You know, the commission can get involved there. And some of our agreements actually involve training. So we would offer, if that was something that the parties were agreeing to, for their training to be provided. And generally it's free training, as long as it's reasonable. They don't want to. They've got 1,000 employees and they want us to train all their employees. We're not likely to be able to do that free, but you know, we can do some focused training for them and provide them with information, that sort of thing. So small business, for example, one of the things we have is a small business kit, and so you know, we say to them, well, you know, obviously you don't want to be back here, so here's some resources, some information about how you might, you know, avoid this sort of thing occurring again.
And Robin, how long would that process have taken?
With that one, about 3 months. Yeah, from the time we get the complaint to now. That's changed a bit because it's now taking a lot longer because of resourcing issues, but yeah, about 3 months for that one. Okay, so case study 2, if you want to read that through, but Philip's a teacher. He has his wife who he's caring for. She has advanced MS. He needs some flexibility around his ability to attend staff meetings. So he's saying, well, you know, previously he was able to attend, you know, to care for his wife and not attend staff meetings, but the new principal's now come in and said, well, that's not going to happen any longer. And you know, you need to be at the staff meetings. You know, and there's no compromise here. So, you know, the comment as part of that complaint was that he picked the wrong person to mess with. So, you know, and we do see this a lot where if you have new managers or new supervisors come in and there's been previous existing relationships and suddenly that becomes no-go, you know, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And, you know, and this is when these sort of complaints come up as well. So Phil had tried to resolve it within the school. He'd actually, you know, had meetings with the principal. He'd try to, you know, offer her other alternatives. I can ring in from home. You know, I can obviously read the minutes when I need to. Those sorts of things. But it was a no, flat no. And so the same sort of questions. Is it fair? Do you think it's, you know, unfair? Could that be unlawful discrimination? A few people are nodding, yeah. Could be. Again, it gets down to the reasonableness as well, so always going to be a case of that. And so the outcome was, I mean, yeah, once we sat down with the parties and talked about it, you know, this is the outcome. I mean, I don't know, you know, sometimes I feel like banging my head against the table because you think, well, this could have been, you know, sorted out at the school level with assistants, and so it does get sometimes a bit, frustrating, but the outcome was positive. There was, he could attend important meetings, that was a requirement, that he had to be there for those, but he put an apology in. And again, that sort of thing. You can read minutes, everybody, can look at the minutes, if there's any important issues, and you can catch up with the principal over those at another time. But yeah, so sometimes it's a really what seems to be a really straightforward and very practical way of resolving the complaint. It doesn't always involve money, doesn't always involve an apology, those sorts of things. So yeah, it can be something as straightforward as that.
Was there some clarification around important as well? What classified as being important?
Yeah, I mean that was again a bit subjective, but I think there were certain meetings where there was, say, if they had a guest speaker coming in, or it was a critical policy issue, or for the school, or some decision like that, then he was required to attend. But again, there was a bit of negotiation around that. Any other questions about those things? Again, if you go back to the issue of diversity, embracing people's, who are carrying responsibilities, allowing people to have that flexibility. Again, time and time that comes up. People have carrying responsibilities. They need to, there needs to be some flexibility around them. But again, it's always got to be what's reasonable. All right, so I've got a few minutes to go. Just want to touch on some of the projects that the Commission's working on. So we have a gender equity project, and it's called the Chiefs for Gender Equity. So there's a number of senior, basically CEs from South Australian companies and all companies that are based in South Australia that make up the Chiefs of Gender Equity. And so what they are basically committed to is promoting gender equity in their workplace and making sure that they role model the behaviours and what needs to be done, and promoting that on an ongoing basis in their workplaces. So looking at how they can overcome some of the barriers for women who are trying to move into senior management and those sorts of things. All right, flexible work project. That's a project that basically looks at the flexibility around hours, days of the week, all of those things that can make it easier for people carrying responsibilities, disability, whatever it needs to be. People moving towards retirement as well, who want to work flexibly, so they might not want to work full-time or full hours anymore. And so looking at what employers can do to basically to allow employees to have that flexibility so they can retain talent, particularly when you're talking about more mature age or older workers, but that they can allow them to, I suppose, ease into retirement if that's what they want to do, or they might not have enough superannuation and they don't want to retire and they want to stay on in the workforce, or they just simply want to continue to work but maybe not on a full-time basis as well. There's a 90-day project going on at the moment regarding disability and employment, and so that's focusing on recruitment and retention of people with a disability within the public sector. And so there was a goal, I think, to within that 90 days to have 10 people with a disability. Doesn't seem like a lot, but employed within the public sector, and then that will transfer to an ongoing goals and targets, so that the public sector can start to come somewhere near meeting their targets in that regard as well. And I think there's about half, so 5 people were employed during that project, and then there's 5 people, I suppose, in the pipeline, jobs in the pipeline as well. Okay. The Racism That Stops With Me campaign, has anyone heard about that one? Yeah. It's actually the Federal Australian Human Rights Commission that are leading that campaign, but in South Australia, the Equal Opportunity Commission is, we're leading it here, and all government agencies have signed up for that. That happened about 18 months ago, but that campaign's an ongoing one. You can find out more about it on the website. And then we get to the age issue, the greatest asset, workforce planning for our ageing workforce. And again, public sector, those of you that are from the public sector would know that we have a very high percentage of people over the age of 55 working in the public sector, and so how do we plan for their exit, I suppose, and how do we encourage younger people to come into the public sector as well. anybody would like further information, if you have any specific questions, then please come and talk to me afterwards. I will be around for a while. But if you want more information about what the Commission work is, what is discrimination, what sort of complaints we get, the sort of training we offer, and also the flexibility and some of those projects that we're doing around diversity in the workplace as well, then go to the website. There's